The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine grounds of Windsor Castle as 10-year-old Prince George walked quietly along the stone pathway. His school uniform was perfectly pressed, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, and his backpack slung over one shoulder in the casual way that only children could manage. Today felt different somehow, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. As third in line to the throne, George had grown up surrounded by protocol and ceremony. Every step he took was watched, every word measured, every gesture noted by those whose job it was to protect and guide him. Yet despite the weight of expectation that rested on his young shoulders, there was something refreshingly normal about him that morning. He kicked at a small pebble as he walked, watched a robin hop along the garden wall, and hummed a tune he'd learned in music class. The castle was buzzing with its usual morning activity. Staff members hurried about their duties, gardeners tended to the immaculate flower beds, and security personnel maintained their watchful presence from strategic positions throughout the grounds. It was a well-orchestrated dance that had been performed for centuries, each person knowing their role and executing it with precision. George's destination was the main entrance where his car waited to take him to school. It was a journey he'd made countless times before, but today he found himself walking more slowly than usual, taking in the details of his surroundings that he normally rushed past. The way the morning light hit the ancient stone walls, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the grand corridors, the familiar scent of polish and flowers that seemed to permeate every corner of the castle. As he rounded the corner near the main entrance hall, George noticed something that made him pause. Standing at attention near the great doors was Sergeant William Morrison, a palace guard who had been part of the household staff for over 20 years. George had seen him countless times before, always in his immaculate uniform, always maintaining the perfect posture that his position required. But today, something was different about Sergeant Morrison. His usual rigid stance seemed slightly less steady, and there was something in his expression that caught George's attention. The boy had always been observant, a trait that both delighted and occasionally concerned his parents and tutors. He could read people in a way that was unusual for someone his age, picking up on subtle cues that others might miss. Sergeant Morrison was indeed struggling that morning, though he was doing his best not to show it. The night before, he had received devastating news from the hospital. His elderly father, who had been battling illness for months, had taken a turn for the worse. The doctors had called to say that time was running short, and that if William wanted to see his father one last time, he needed to come soon. But William was torn between duty and family. He had requested emergency leave, but with several other guards already off duty due to illness and scheduling conflicts, his supervisor had reluctantly denied the request. The royal family had important engagements that day, and security could not be compromised. William understood this, had even agreed with the decision when it was explained to him, but his heart was breaking. He had spent the sleepless night wrestling with an impossible choice. His duty to the crown was something he took seriously, something that had defined his career and his sense of purpose for 2 decades. But his father was dying, and the thought of not being there in those final moments was almost unbearable. As he stood at his post that morning, William's mind kept drifting to memories of his father, the man who had taught him to ride a bicycle, who had sat proudly in the audience when William graduated from military academy, who had always been his biggest supporter and harshest critic. His father had been so proud when William was accepted into the palace guard, had told everyone in their small town about his son's prestigious position. Prince George continued to observe the guard, his young mind processing what he was seeing. There was something about the way Sergeant Morrison's shoulders were set, the slight tremor in his hands, the distant look in his eyes that spoke of deep worry. George had seen that look before, on his own mother's face during difficult times, on his father's face when the weight of responsibility seemed particularly heavy. The boy's natural empathy, something that had been nurtured by his parents despite the formal constraints of royal life, made him want to understand what was troubling the guard. He had been taught that everyone in their household, from the most senior advisor to the newest staff member, was important and deserving of respect and kindness. As George approached the entrance where his car was waiting, he made a decision that would surprise everyone present. Instead of walking past Sergeant Morrison as he normally would, perhaps with a polite nod as he had been taught, George stopped directly in front of the guard. "Good morning, Sergeant Morrison, George said quietly, his young voice carrying the clear diction that had been drilled into him through years of elocution lessons. William was startled by the direct address. While the royal family was always polite to staff, it was unusual for such a young member of the family to initiate conversation with a guard on duty. He straightened even more if that were possible, and replied in his trained, professional tone, "Good morning, Your Royal Highness." But George didn't continue walking as expected. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying the guard's face with the intense curiosity that children possess when they sense something important but don't quite understand what it is. "Are you all right, sir?" George asked, the question so simple and sincere that it caught William completely off guard. The unexpected kindness in the boy's voice, the genuine concern from someone who had no obligation to care about his personal troubles, nearly undid William's careful composure. For a moment, his professional mask slipped, and George could see the pain and worry that lay beneath. Yes, Your Highness. Thank you for asking," William managed. Though his voice was slightly rougher than usual, George continued to study him, and something in the boy's expression suggested that he didn't quite believe the guard's assurance. There was an intelligence in those young eyes that was both remarkable and slightly unnerving. It was as if George could see right through the polite lies that adults told to maintain appearances. The other staff members in the vicinity had begun to notice the unusual interaction. The prince's protection officer took a step closer, ready to intervene if necessary, though he seemed more curious than concerned. The driver waited patiently by the car, accustomed to the occasional delays that came with transporting members of the royal family. "My grandmother always says that when someone is carrying heavy thoughts, sharing them can make them lighter," George said, his words carrying wisdom that seemed beyond his years. "Is there something heavy you're carrying today, Sergeant Morrison?" The question was so direct, so compassionate, and so unexpected that William found himself struggling to maintain his professional demeanor. Here was this 10-year-old boy, heir to a throne, taking time from his morning to check on the well-being of a guard. It was both touching and remarkable. William glanced around, acutely aware that their conversation was being observed by others. Protocol dictated that he should deflect the question politely and allow the prince to continue on his way. But there was something in George's earnest expression that made him want to be honest. "My father is very ill, Your Highness," William said quietly, the words coming out before he could stop them. "He's in hospital, and the doctors say, well, they say I should come soon if I want to say goodbye." The admission hung in the air between them, and William immediately regretted his honesty. It wasn't appropriate to burden a child with such adult concerns, regardless of that child's royal status. He began to formulate an apology, a way to backtrack from his moment of weakness. But George's response was not what anyone expected. The boy's expression grew serious, and he nodded slowly, as if he understood the weight of what he'd been told. "That must be very frightening," George said simply. "I'm sorry your father is so sick. Are you able to go see him?" The question went straight to the heart of William's dilemma, and he found himself explaining his situation to this 10-year-old prince with an honesty that surprised even him. Perhaps it was because George had asked with such genuine concern, or perhaps because the boy's youth made him feel like a safe confidant. But William found himself telling George about his conflict between duty and family. As William spoke, George listened with the kind of focused attention that was rare in children his age. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes, didn't try to minimize the guard's concerns. He simply listened. And in that listening, William felt heard in a way that he hadn't experienced in his years of service. When William finished speaking, George was quiet for a long moment, his young mind clearly working through what he had learned. The other staff members watched in fascination as the boy processed the information, his expression thoughtful and mature. What happened next would be talked about in the palace for years to come, a moment that would define not just George's character, but his understanding of what it truly meant to serve others and to lead with compassion. George stood quietly for several moments, his young face serious as he considered what Sergeant Morrison had shared with him. Around them, the usual morning bustle of the castle continued, but there seemed to be a bubble of stillness surrounding the boy and the guard. The other staff members maintained their positions but couldn't help stealing glances at the unusual scene unfolding before them. "Sergeant Morrison," George finally said, his voice carrying a gravity that seemed far beyond his 10 years. "May I ask you something?" William nodded, still somewhat amazed that he was having this conversation with a member of the royal family, let alone one so young. "If your father could see you right now, standing here doing your duty even though your heart is hurting, what do you think he would say?" The question hit William like a physical blow. His father had always been proud of his son's service, had often spoken about the honor of protecting the royal family. But William also knew that his father, a man who had prioritized family above all else, would never want duty to prevent a final goodbye. "He would tell me to go to him," William answered honestly, his voice barely above a whisper. George nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. Then, in a gesture that would be remembered by everyone present, the young prince did something extraordinary. He stepped back from Sergeant Morrison and, with the same formal precision that he had been taught for state occasions, George bowed deeply to the guard. The effect was immediate and stunning. Every person in the vicinity stopped what they were doing, their attention now fully focused on the unprecedented scene before them. A member of the royal family, third in line to the throne, was bowing to a palace guard. It was unthinkable, unprecedented, and yet utterly genuine. When George straightened up, his eyes met William's directly. "Thank you for your service, Sergeant Morrison," he said clearly, his young voice carrying across the suddenly silent entrance hall. "And thank you for trusting me with something so important about your family." William felt his eyes fill with tears, something that hadn't happened during his 20 years of service. The simple dignity of the gesture, the respect it conveyed, the humanity it represented. It was overwhelming. But George wasn't finished. He turned to his protection officer, who was watching the scene with barely concealed amazement. "Could you please help me contact my father?" George asked politely. "I think there's something important I need to discuss with him." The protection officer, a seasoned professional who had seen many unusual situations during his years of service, found himself momentarily speechless. After a brief pause, he nodded and reached for his secure communication device. Within minutes, Prince William was on the line. George took the phone with the careful respect he always showed for important conversations, and stepped slightly away for privacy, though his words were still audible to those nearby. "Hello, Papa," George said, his formal tone softening into the natural affection he felt for his father. "I'm sorry to call you at work, but something important has happened, and I need to ask you about it." He went on to explain, in simple but clear terms, what he had learned about Sergeant Morrison's situation. He spoke without drama or emotional manipulation, simply presenting the facts as he understood them, and asking for his father's guidance. Prince William listened without interruption, and those watching could see George nodding occasionally, clearly receiving advice or instructions. The conversation lasted several minutes, and when it ended, George handed the phone back to his protection officer with a solemn, "Thank you." He then walked back to Sergeant Morrison, who had maintained his position but was clearly struggling with the emotions that the morning's events had stirred up. "Sergeant Morrison," George said formally, "my father would like to speak with you, if that's acceptable." William nodded, not trusting his voice, and accepted the phone that the protection officer handed to him. The conversation that followed was brief but meaningful. Prince William's words were kind but decisive, and when the call ended, William's face showed a mixture of relief, gratitude, and lingering disbelief. "His Royal Highness has granted me emergency leave," William said to George, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm to leave immediately for the hospital." George smiled, the first truly childlike expression he had shown since the conversation began. "I'm very glad," he said simply. "I hope you get to have a good visit with your father." But the extraordinary morning wasn't over yet. As arrangements were quickly made for William's replacement and his immediate departure, George did something else that surprised everyone present. He approached his protection officer again. "Could you please arrange for a car to take Sergeant Morrison to the hospital?" he asked. "And could someone contact the hospital to let them know he's coming? I think it would be good if they were expecting him." The request was delivered with the same polite authority that George had been taught to use when making official requests, but the kindness behind it was purely his own. As the morning unfolded, Word of the incident began to spread through the castle. Staff members who had witnessed the events shared the story with colleagues, and the tale grew in the telling. Some focused on the unprecedented nature of a royal family member bowing to a guard, others on the compassion shown by such a young person, and still others on the practical problem-solving that George had demonstrated. But for William Morrison, rushing through London traffic toward the hospital where his father lay dying, the memory that stayed with him was simpler and more profound. A 10-year-old boy had seen his pain, had cared enough to ask about it, and had acted with both kindness and decisive authority to help solve a problem that seemed impossible. When William arrived at the hospital, he found his father weak but conscious, and they were able to have the conversation that William had feared he might never get to have. His father passed away peacefully 3 days later, with William at his bedside, holding his hand and sharing stories of his work at the palace, including the remarkable morning when a young prince had shown him what true leadership looked like. Back at the castle, George went to school as usual, though his teachers noted that he seemed more thoughtful than usual during his lessons. When asked about his morning during lunch break, he simply said that he had learned something important about helping people, though he didn't elaborate. The story might have ended there. A touching but private moment between a young prince and a loyal guard, if not for what happened next. The incident had been witnessed by enough people that it became impossible to keep completely quiet, and within days, senior members of the royal household staff were discussing the morning's events. The consensus was remarkable. In 20 minutes of conversation and action, 10-year-old Prince George had demonstrated qualities that many leaders never develop. Genuine empathy, the ability to listen without judgment, decisive action in the face of complexity, and most importantly, the understanding that true authority comes from service to others rather than power over them. When news of the incident eventually reached other members of the royal family, the reactions were telling. The Queen, when informed of her great-grandson's actions, was said to have smiled and commented that George was clearly learning the right lessons about duty and compassion. Prince Charles expressed pride in his grandson's instinctive understanding of leadership, while Catherine and William were moved by their son's natural empathy and practical wisdom. But perhaps the most significant reaction came from an unexpected source. 3 weeks after William Morrison returned from his father's funeral, a letter arrived at the castle addressed to Prince George. It was from Morrison's elderly neighbor, who had been caring for the guard's father during his illness. The letter, written in careful handwriting on simple stationery, thanked George for his kindness and explained how much it had meant to both William and his father to know that their sacrifice had been seen and valued. She went on to describe how William had been able to share the story of George's gesture with his father and how much comfort it had brought to the dying man to know that his son was serving a family that truly cared about the people who worked for them. The letter concluded with a simple observation that would stay with George for years to come. Your kindness reminded my friend that he was seen as a person, not just a uniform. In a world where people can feel invisible, that gift of recognition is more precious than you might know. Reading that letter, George began to understand something important about the responsibility that would one day be his. It wasn't just about ceremonies and state occasions, about cutting ribbons and making speeches. It was about recognizing the humanity in every person he encountered and using his position not to be served, but to serve others. The weeks following the incident brought subtle but significant changes to daily life at Windsor Castle. Word of Prince George's compassionate gesture had spread through the household staff, creating ripples of respect and admiration that touched every corner of the royal residence. Staff members who had worked there for decades found themselves looking at the young prince with new eyes, seeing in him qualities that gave them hope for the future of the monarchy. George himself seemed largely unaware of the impact his actions had created. He continued with his usual routine of school, lessons, and family time. But those who worked closely with him began to notice small changes in his behavior. He had always been polite to staff members, as he had been taught, but now there was something deeper in his interactions. A genuine interest in the people around him that went beyond mere courtesy. Mrs. Elizabeth Harper, who had been part of the housekeeping staff for 15 years, first noticed this change during one of George's regular visits to his grandmother. As she was dusting the corridor outside the Queen's private sitting room, George emerged from his visit, looking thoughtful. "Mrs. Harper," he said, approaching her with the same careful attention he had shown Sergeant Morrison weeks earlier. "You've been working here for a long time, haven't you?" Elizabeth was surprised by the question but answered politely that yes, she had been with the household for many years. "Do you enjoy your work?" George continued, and there was something in his tone that suggested this wasn't just polite conversation. The question caught Elizabeth off guard. In her 15 years of service, no member of the royal family had ever asked her about her job satisfaction. She found herself giving an honest answer about the pride she took in maintaining the historic rooms and being part of preserving the castle's heritage. George listened intently, asking follow-up questions about her favorite rooms to work in and whether there were challenges in her role that he might not understand. By the end of their 10-minute conversation, Elizabeth felt that she had been truly heard by someone who would one day be king, and George had gained insight into yet another perspective on life within the royal household. Similar conversations began happening throughout the castle. George would stop to chat with gardeners about their work, ask kitchen staff about their favorite recipes to prepare, and inquire about the challenges faced by security personnel. Each interaction was brief but meaningful, and word of the young prince's genuine interest in their lives spread quickly among the staff. The impact extended beyond individual conversations. Senior staff members began reporting to the household management team that morale had noticeably improved. There was a sense of pride and purpose that seemed to energize everyone from the newest recruits to the most veteran employees. They felt valued in a way that went beyond their paychecks and job security. They felt seen and appreciated as individuals. Prince William and Catherine began to hear these reports during their regular meetings with household staff. The changes in their son had not gone unnoticed by them either. While George had always been a thoughtful child, there was now a depth to his empathy that impressed and sometimes worried his parents. They wondered if the weight of understanding others' struggles might be too much for a 10-year-old to carry. Their concerns led to a family conversation one evening after George had finished his homework. Catherine, settling beside her son in the library, brought up the reports they had been hearing about his conversations with staff members. "We've heard that you've been spending more time talking with the people who work here," she said gently. "That's wonderful, George. But I want to make sure you understand that you don't have to carry everyone's problems on your shoulders." George looked up from the book he had been reading, his expression serious but not troubled. "I know, Mum," he said simply. "I just think that sometimes people feel invisible. And I don't want anyone to feel that way when they're around me." The wisdom in his words, delivered with such matter-of-fact sincerity, left both parents momentarily speechless. Prince William sat down across from his son, recognizing something familiar in George's sentiment. "That's a very grown-up way of thinking about things," William said carefully. "But remember that you're still a child. And it's okay to just be a child sometimes." George nodded, but then added something that showed how deeply the morning with Sergeant Morrison had affected him. "Granny says that being royal means being able to serve others, even when it's difficult. Sergeant Morrison was serving us even when his heart was breaking. And I think that makes him braver than any soldier. I just want to make sure I see that bravery when people show it." The conversation that followed was one that the family would remember for years to come. George, with the clarity that sometimes comes naturally to children, explained his understanding that his future role would involve responsibility for many people's well-being. He wanted to practice recognizing and responding to that responsibility while he was still young enough to learn from his mistakes. His parents were struck by the maturity of his perspective, but also by his recognition that he was still learning. They talked about the balance between caring for others and maintaining his own emotional health, about the difference between helping and trying to fix everything, and about the importance of asking for help when problems seem too big to handle alone. As autumn progressed, the effects of George's approach to his role continued to evolve. Staff members began to feel more comfortable bringing forward suggestions for improvements to working conditions or efficiency. The atmosphere within the household became more collaborative, with people at all levels feeling that their perspectives were valued. One particularly meaningful moment came when James Patterson, a young footman who had only recently joined the household staff, approached George during one of the prince's walks through the castle grounds. James had been struggling with homesickness and uncertainty about whether he was suited for royal service, and George's reputation for listening had given him the courage to speak up. Their conversation, which lasted nearly half an hour, covered everything from James's adjustment to palace life to his concerns about making mistakes in such a formal environment. George listened without judgment, shared some of his own experiences of feeling overwhelmed by expectations, and suggested practical resources that might help James feel more confident in his role. The interaction had a profound effect on James, who went on to become one of the most dedicated and skilled members of the household staff. Years later, he would credit that conversation with Prince George as the moment he realized that service to the royal family was not about perfect performance, but about genuine dedication to shared values. But perhaps the most significant development came 6 months after the original incident with Sergeant Morrison. William Morrison himself returned to his duties at the castle, having taken extended leave to handle his father's affairs and process his grief. When he resumed his position, he found that the atmosphere within the household had changed in ways that made his difficult transition back to work much easier. His first day back, George made a point of greeting him personally, asking about his well-being and expressing condolences for his loss. The conversation was brief and respectful, acknowledging the grief Morrison carried, while also welcoming him back to the palace family. "I'm glad you were able to be with your father," George said simply. "I hope the time you had together brought you comfort." Morrison later said that the young prince's words helped him understand that his father's death had not been in vain, that the values his father had instilled in him about service and dignity were being recognized and honored by the family he served. As George's 11th birthday approached, his parents reflected on the remarkable growth they had witnessed in their son over the past year. The incident with Sergeant Morrison had been a catalyst, but the changes in George went deeper than any single event. He was developing into a young man who understood that leadership meant service, that authority came with responsibility, and that true strength lay in lifting others up rather than standing above them. The final testament to the impact of George's approach came in an unexpected form. The household staff, working together across all departments, organized a small celebration for George's birthday that was unlike anything previously arranged for a young royal family member. Instead of expensive gifts or elaborate ceremonies, they created a book of letters and photographs, documenting how their work contributed to the daily life of the royal family. Each letter expressed appreciation for George's recognition of their efforts and explained how their role, no matter how small it might seem, was part of the larger mission of supporting the monarchy. The Gardiners wrote about maintaining the beauty that welcomed visitors from around the world. The kitchen staff described the pride they took in preparing meals that brought the family together. The security team explained how their vigilance protected not just the royal family, but the institution they represented. When George received this gift, he spent hours reading every letter, studying every photograph, and discussing the contents with his parents. The book became one of his most treasured possessions, a reminder of the interconnected community that surrounded him and the responsibility he would one day have to care for all of them. The impact of Prince George's quiet gesture that morning had grown far beyond anyone's expectations. What began as a simple act of compassion had transformed the culture of an entire household, created new standards for how leadership could be exercised, and established a foundation for the kind of king George might one day become. The story of the morning when a 10-year-old prince bowed to a grieving guard became a legend within the palace walls, passed down to new staff members as an example of the values they were expected to embody. It served as a reminder that true nobility came not from birthright or ceremony, but from the courage to see others' humanity and respond with kindness. Years later, when historians would write about the early character development of King George VII, many would point to this incident as a defining moment. But for George himself, it remained simply the day he learned that the most important part of being royal was being human first.